Welcome, everyone, to IGP Rapid Response, What's Next for Ukraine? My name is Karen Yarhimilo. I'm the Dean of SIPA and the Adlai E. Stevenson Professor of International Relations. This has been an extraordinary past few weeks in the war in Ukraine. In their Oval Office meeting last week, we saw the tense relationship between President Trump and Ukrainian President Zelensky. His administration later put a pause on US military aid and intelligence sharing to Ukraine and accused his Ukrainian counterpart of not being serious about peace. Zelensky has since admitted it's time to make things right with Washington and with talk of a deal to allow the US to tap into Ukraine's mineral deposits still on the table. Now, regardless of what happens next, the future of Ukraine, transatlantic relations, and NATO hangs in the balance. And in the SIPA community, as you know, there are many different viewpoints of how to end this war, including the strategies and approaches to doing so. And so, as well as assessments of President Trump's approach to negotiating and his approach to deal making. SIPA's Institute of Global Politics, IGP, will continue to offer as many perspectives as possible on ongoing efforts to bring peace to Ukraine. And I encourage you to view the many clips and programs recording on our website. So this moment, as you can imagine, has profound implications for all of us at SIPA, as a school that is training the next generation of diplomats, policymakers, and leaders. It is reshaping our understanding of international relations and norms and the conduct of US foreign policy. So what does it all mean for the future of Ukraine? What are the implications for NATO and the future of European security? And where are US-Russian relations heading? We will discuss these and other questions in the Rapid Response webinar on Ukraine, in this one sponsored by IGP, and in other ones as well. So I'm really pleased to welcome our distinguished panels of experts and practitioners. Before introducing today's lineup, I want to acknowledge that our experts today have incredible depth and knowledge. They and this panel will shed light on how some in the United States are analyzing the situation. And panels we've hosted in the past and will hold in the future will include European and Ukrainian perspectives as well. So please stay tuned. So to introduce the panelists today, I'm really pleased to welcome my good friend, my colleague, co-teacher, Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton. She's a professor of international and public affairs, the former Secretary of State, and a former senator from New York, and is the IGP Faculty Advisory Board Chair. We have with us also Steve Biddle, is a professor here at SIPA, a member of the Saltzman Institute, who's written extensively about the war in Ukraine for publications like Foreign Affairs and others. We have Ian Bremmer, professor and founder of president and founder of the Eurasia Group and GZERO, as well as an adjunct professor here at SIPA. Timothy Fry is the Marshall Shulman Professor of Post-Soviet Foreign Policy here at Columbia University. Ambassador Victoria Newland is Professor of International Diplomacy at SIPA, where she's also the director of the International Fellows Program. She served as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, and U.S. Ambassador to NATO. Welcome, everyone, and thank you again for participating. We'll try to focus on three broad themes today, looking at what happened last week, U.S.-Ukrainian negotiations to end the war, that's one. We're looking at how the Trump stance on this conflict is viewed from the perspective of Russia and Putin. And then finally, we'll turn to looking at current European discussions to send more aid to Ukraine, as well as future peacekeepers and what it means for the future of NATO. All right, so let's get started. Start with you, Secretary Clinton. We all saw the blow up in the Oval Office. Do you think that there is a constructive road back to dialogue between the Trump and the Zelensky teams. What are the chances of a peace agreement being reached in Ukraine? And what are the security assurances that you think will be needed to make such an agreement stick that would deter Russia from just violating it, honestly?
Well, Karen, thank you. And thanks to all of us for gathering to talk about this important set of issues. Look, I think that there is always the potential for a constructive road back to dialogue between Trump and Zelensky and their teams. But I'm hoping that one of the takeaways from what happened in the Oval Office is that Ukraine cannot be shut out from any negotiations with anybody about its own future. We saw the Trump administration in its first term eliminate any representation from the Afghan government in their conversations with the Taliban. And I thought that was a serious error, and I don't want to see it repeated now. The idea that Trump and Putin, through their representatives, could determine the future of Ukraine was a bad idea when it was first suggested, and following what happened in the Oval Office, I hope that it's an idea that doesn't get resuscitated. Whether there is a chance of a peace agreement being reached really depends upon, whether or not Ukraine believes that there are conditions being met that will protect its sovereignty and its territory, that there are security agreements of credible measures that they can count on. And that conversation, best as I know, has not even really begun. So Ukraine has to do some very serious thinking about assuming they are at the table, and I would not recognize any agreement that came out of any negotiation where they weren't at the table, and that they are clear in their expectations and demands. I would also like to see Europe at the table and have a voice in what is going to be a decision that will certainly impact European security. So when we talk about security assurances, until we get into some format where the parties who are most directly affected are speaking for themselves, we don't know what, if any, security assurances are going to be adequate. The only silver lining out of that disgraceful, shameful episode in the Oval Office is that it opened a lot of people's eyes here in America and certainly around the world, particularly in Europe, that Trump and his administration are not reliable partners. They're not reliable partners when it comes certainly to dealing with Russia. So there has to be a recognition that those of us in the United States who see how important it is that any peace agreement be have security agreements embedded in it, and that it's hard to explain why Trump is giving a lifeline to Russia at this point without any conditions being demanded. So let's see how the next days unfold.
Thank you, Secretary Clinton. Toria, Secretary Nuland, Ambassador Nuland, someone who's been on the front lines in Ukraine during some pretty tense moments for that country. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on America's and Europe's latest movements on Ukraine. The US, now we know, has appeared to hit pause on military aid and intelligence sharing to Ukraine, and European leaders I think are meeting today to secure 700 billion euros in military aid. But really, can other countries in Europe realistically fill the gap? A number of countries have made pledges over the past week, but is it enough? And also, would Ukraine be in danger of collapse without US aid, in your assessment?
Well, thank you, Dean, and it's great to be with everybody. Let me just start by saying I couldn't agree more strongly with Secretary Clinton. Nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. Any peace that is endeavored between the US and Russia over Ukraine and Europe's head will not be stable, and will not last, and will cause extreme volatility, not only in Ukraine, but potentially embolden Russia to go further. So it's very, very important that Ukraine be involved. As you said, Karen, Europe's had a very stark wake-up call with regard to this administration's approach to these negotiations. And Ukraine's had a very stark wake-up call. All of the pressure of the last 6 weeks has been applied on Ukraine, the cutoff of military aid, the cutoff of intelligence, and as we said, what happened in the Oval and the pressure on critical minerals. There has not been commensurate pressure on Russia, and it's going to take two to come to the table. And as any of us who have negotiated know, you need leverage with both sides if you want to cut a deal. So Europe is gathered today, and they are very intentional now about ensuring that they are Ukraine's supporter and backstop in a situation where the US seems to be leaning more towards Putin's point of view. As you said, the overall goal over time is some 800 billion in new defense investment. The goal for today, as they gather, is to get support for for President van der Leyen's proposal. It's called Rearm EU, for a $150 billion loan program for European governments to invest both in their own rearming, but also in programs in Ukraine to produce drones, to produce artillery, etc. There's also a German and Commission proposal to lift some of the caps that Europe has had on itself with regard to debt levels and deficit levels, so that governments in the EU can spend more for defense at this essential moment for themselves, for Ukraine, and to strengthen NATO. Look, it is really very, very important that in this period that Europe not only be able to step up, but step up fast, because as the artillery shells run out, as the air defense interceptors run out, as the ability to produce drones at scale, which have made the difference for Ukraine on the battlefield, gets harder. Europe has the capacity, not only with these proposals, but conceivably collateralizing against frozen assets that they are holding of Putin's, at least for a short time, to do more and to do it fast. The thing that's concerning me most today is the cutoff of intelligence streams from the United States, and pressure on allies like the UK not to use US intelligence for their own weapons. The primary purpose of US intelligence has been to help the Ukrainians see Russian attacks coming and have advanced warning. There are also key weapon systems that do not cue and do not hit their targets without support from US satellite cueing and the military GPS system. So people are going to die. Ukrainians are going to die, more of them, if this pause lasts significantly longer. And it is dangerous, and it's not a capability that Europe can replace with any kind of speed.
Thank you, Toria. Ian, turning to you, the current administration has accused Ukraine and Zelensky of not being willing or ready for peace. Is this a fair charge in your opinion? And how do you evaluate Ukraine's position? I mean, Zelensky and Kyiv are also asking for stronger security guarantees from the United States and Europe before considering a ceasefire on the current lines or any broader peace. So what is, in your opinion, also Kyiv seeking, and is it a legitimate ask, or you would think it might be a stalling tactic?
It's a legitimate ask if it comes from a president that's actually interested in working with allies to build a long-term and sustainable peace based on common principles and values that we have established through NATO for decades and decades. That is not, of course, where Trump comes to this conversation. So I don't think Zelensky has anything to apologize for. There have been very difficult times between Biden and Zelensky. Zelensky blamed Biden, for not getting Ukraine into NATO to begin with. And I mean, pipsqueak young guy from Ukraine is saying that to the American president. I mean, Biden didn't like that at all. So I'm not surprised that Zelensky was baitable by J.D. Vance and Trump in the conversation with the White House. And certainly one thing that should not happen going forward is Zelensky should not have any more meetings with the Americans by himself. He should be accompanied by adults, right? As we say on the Walt Disney rides. The Europeans need to go along. And clearly they are. I think what's really interesting here, I do now believe in a way that I didn't a week ago, that the Europeans are prepared to stand up for their defense, for European defense going forward, without the United States over the course of the coming years to defend themselves against the Russians. I really believe that. I believe that from the Germans, the French. I believe that across the board, the Poles, you name it. But I'm not sure to what extent that comes too late for the Ukrainians. That is, of course, the big question we're asking right now, especially when the Americans are cutting off intelligence. And I agree completely with Tori, and I saw the way that Hillary as well was shaking her head. I mean, a lot of Ukrainians are going to die because of this completely unnecessary decision by Trump. I mean, the upside, I suppose, is it's a lot fewer than the number of kids that are going to die around the world because of all the healthcare support that's been cut off by USAID. But I mean, I'm not sure that's a comparative metric we want to be using in this conversation. So, I mean, if you are the Europeans right now, in my view, it's not just that you deserve a seat at the table. You actually should be driving the conversation. I mean, if you're the ones that are going to have to put boots on the ground, and the Americans aren't going to do a backstop, if you're the ones that have to provide all the leadership economically in reconstructing Ukraine and helping to defend Ukraine, and the Americans are saying very clearly, we're not it, then the Europeans are the ones should be driving negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. And Keir Starmer and Macron have had that conversation, and they've had that conversation with Trump. And as of now, the White House is kind of waiting to see what the Europeans come up with. So I'm hopeful that they'll be able to do a lot more. There's an interesting analogy here as well with the completely failed Trump idea on Gaza, where all the Palestinians are going to leave voluntarily, magically, and we're going to create a Riviera. That ain't going to happen. And now it turns out the Saudis and the Egyptians and others are trying to drive a deal that is plausible. Well, hopefully, I mean, Trump is not going to drive a deal that's plausible. The only deal he can drive that's plausible is the one that is bilateral with Russia, which he is very interested in doing, perhaps even without a Ukrainian ceasefire. But a deal that's plausible in terms of Ukrainian peace and stability is going to be driven primarily by the Europeans, with the Ukrainians and the Russians at the table. And we will see over the coming days and weeks where that goes.
Interesting. Well, we'll get back to this. First, I'm gonna go to Tim Fry. So let's turn to Ukraine for a second. How is this fracture in U.S.-Ukrainian relations being perceived in Kyiv? And there are reports that Trump officials have met with opposition candidates there and may want Zelensky to step down. Is Zelensky presidency secure? Are we seeing a rally around the flag effect in Ukraine, or are the Ukrainians turning against him? So what can you tell us about how this is being processed and assessed in Kyiv?
Well, Zelensky's approval ratings are increasing. Their last numbers were around 63%, a number that many democratically elected leaders would be very happy to have, especially during a war that's gone on for 3 years. We've been doing survey research in Ukraine about war termination. And what we find is top of mind for the Ukrainians is less the territorial issues. I think most Ukrainians recognize that the territories that the Russians hold are going to be difficult to get back, particularly through a negotiation. They don't want to give up any more territory that they control right now. But the key issue is security guarantees. In all the research that we've done, adding security guarantees, either through NATO or even without NATO, perhaps through troops on the grounds with the Europeans, that's what really flips popular opinion in support of a security guarantee. I mean, In some sense, Trump has a Zelensky problem in that they don't get along, but he also has a Ukraine problem, and that Ukrainians are tired of the war, but they're even more tired of the Russian threat. And with fighting that's been going on since 2014. So the Ukrainians recognize that Zelensky is in a very difficult place. But I think this is a moment where Ukrainians will be more likely to rally around Zelensky in hopes of getting a better deal than abandoning him.
Thank you, Tim. Steve, let's turn to you to the war itself. 3 years ago, the war appears to be locked in a stalemate. Currently, if you had to give us, quick analysis, what's the current military situation, and how long can the Ukrainian military realistically can last if no more American aid is forthcoming and US intelligence? And can the Europeans also, again, in this context, make up the difference, especially in high-end weapons like air defenses that the Americans used to provide? Or to invert the question, what military outcome is possible if the United States discontinues its assistance?
Yeah, Ukraine has been a war position for basically the last 2 years, in which the lines aren't literally frozen in place, but it requires a substantial numerical advantage, patience, and willingness to accept high casualty rates in order to advance. The Russians have had those advantages, and as a result, they've been able to grind forward slowly, expensively, at a huge toll in human life. But there have been no quick breakthroughs, and none are likely. And that's a reflection of the structural, systematic difficulty of penetrating deep, well-prepared defenses of the kind that we've seen on both sides of the front line in this war for essentially the last 2 years. Now, there are two things that might change this pattern of slow, expensive, but progressive Russian ground gain, as we've seen over the last couple of years in the near term. The obvious one is the withdrawal of US assistance, both material assistance, but also, as Ambassador Nuland and Secretary Clinton were pointing out, the restriction of US intelligence support for the Ukrainians. So estimates vary, but I'd say a best guess for how long Ukraine could maintain something like the current tempo of operations and current rate of firepower delivery without US assistance is into the summer. After which time they would not be able to sustain current operational tempo, and the rate of Russian advance would increase substantially. I think it's unlikely that there would be a complete breakthrough under those circumstances, depending on Ukrainian morale, more in just a moment. But there would be a significant increase in the rate at which Russia can take ground, which shifts bargaining leverage dramatically in Putin's favor. When Putin is taking ground, his incentives to do a compromise deal are even lower than they would be otherwise. The other near-term variable that could change this positional war problem is Ukrainian morale. Ukraine has been taking heavy casualties. Their ability to maintain troop density at the front is increasingly stressed, and we're beginning to see morale indications that are dangerous, like an increasing desertion rate among Ukrainian forces. If a combination of US abandonment, accelerated Russian pressure, and difficulty by Ukraine in populating the front radically changes Ukrainian morale, then you could see some kind of a collapse. Barring that, the next big possibility for a change is about a year from now when Russia burns through the last of its armored vehicle stocks. So you have this interesting temporal situation in which the near-term situation for Ukraine is very unfavorable, and radically so if the US withdraws support. Ukrainian leverage could very well increase a year out or so as Russia exhausts some of its higher-end material capabilities, depending on whether they can get restored by the Chinese and North Koreans or others. Whether we can get to the longer term at the moment militarily is very unclear.
Very interesting. I want us to shift slightly to think about the situations through the lens of Putin and Russia. So Secretary Clinton, let me go to you first. So it's been said that Vladimir Putin is the biggest winner from this whole rift in US-NATO, US-Ukrainian relations. Now, he has not said much publicly since the Oval Office meeting last week. What do you think Putin will demand?
Well, I don't know that he has to publicly demand. He has Trump doing it for him. And I think whatever the back channel communications that are going on, which probably include Trump and Musk and Witkoff and others who are part of the Trump team, I think he has to just sit and wait. And I think that has been his strategy for the return of Trump, and knowing that Trump will carry a lot of water for him. And I think that he's hoping to get as much flexibility with as few, if any, concessions that he can manage. And as long as Trump does the heavy lifting, basically giving up every negotiating position, taking NATO off the table, making it very clear that the minerals and other things are up for grabs between, frankly, the US and Russia, and not including in any legitimate, fair way Ukraine itself. So when we think about what Putin will demand, I think he's playing the waiting game, and he has every reason to play the waiting game, because he's got agents who are, basically acting as his proxies in giving up on the front end any leverage and pressuring both in private and in public his principal adversary, Zelensky, in order to see how far, Trump can push the situation to advantage him.
Do you think that a pause in the fighting and recognition, whether implicitly or explicitly, of his seized Ukrainian territory be sufficient for him? You think he would go for more concessions on the broader security demands? I mean, you have any ideas on that? And maybe Tim also wants to jump in afterward.
Well, look, I think whatever he might accept is not the final deal. I don't have any illusions about his constant appetite for more territory, and his belief that Ukraine in itself is an illegitimate nation, and he has every right and reason, therefore, to continue aggression against it. You might get a temporary pause, which would only advantage Putin. He can, try to ramp up industrial production, try to get more North Koreans to show up. I mean, whatever it is that he would do in any kind of pause. But I don't think that is the end of his ambitions. And I agree with what has been said about Europe. I mean, yes, Europe is reacting, obviously, against what they have seen coming from Trump, but they're also under enormous pressure from a lot of the border states that are clearly worried about what Putin would do to them if given a chance. So this is not just about Ukraine. It's never been just about Ukraine, but particularly now, as we try to game out what Putin would or would not do, you have to look at the entire landscape and the dangers that, the Baltics and Poland and Moldova and others are under.
Thank you. Tim, you wrote and you studied Putin. What's your assessment about how he's thinking, viewing the situation right now?
Yeah, I think he'll be patient. As long as they're making grains on the ground, it's difficult to see them, reaching any kind of agreement. President Trump has said that when asked about peacekeepers in Ukraine, President Trump said that Putin has no problem with it, which of course the Kremlin immediately shot down. And Lavrov came out and said, no, this would be completely unacceptable. The Kremlin spokesman Peskov earlier this week said that Russian war aims haven't changed since February 2022, which means basically the collapse of the Ukrainian state into something that looks like Belarus. And what worries me is that, you know, to create stability in Europe, you either need to deter Russia militarily or to change Russia from within and to weaken the groups that are most likely to support continuing the war. And this lopsided approach that the White House is taking by putting all pressure on Ukraine undermines both of those. I mean, berating a partner in public isn't great for credibility about your willingness to come to their defense, and allowing the Kremlin to achieve a lopsided peace deal would only strengthen those forces within Russia that are likely to want to take another bite of Ukraine and not Ukraine alone. So if we think about like the post-Putin Russia, you know, if we want to think longer term, allowing the Kremlin to declare a victory, you know, could really increase threat levels in Europe for a long period. So I think that's important to consider as well.
Yeah. Ian and Toria, to both of you, so, you know, Putin and Lavrov have also said that Moscow's biggest security needs must be addressed, and that the pre-invasion proposal, which Lavrov, I think at some point called non-negotiable, essentially calls for like relitigation of the European security architecture to include no further NATO expansion, no NATO forces, and weapons in states that entered NATO since 1997. Is it a non-negotiable for Europe? What is your assessment? Ian and then Toria.
Okay, I'm happy to let Toria go first, but I think first of all, you did see that Trump reiterated his America's commitment to Article 5, collective security with NATO in the last week, that we said that the U.S. wouldn't have to use it, would never have to be used, ostensibly because he trusts Russia around this, I guess. He also said after meeting with President Duda in Poland that the Americans would stay on the ground there. It wasn't clear whether he was talking about the troops that are there or whether he was talking about the command post. I'm not sure he knows the difference. But you know, clearly part of this is because Poland is now stepping up. They're going to be at 5% defense spend of GDP, which is the highest level that, you know, Trump has demanded. So, I mean, I think, again, if you take what Trump is saying now at his word, and that can change at any point, then, you know, you would say that as long as the Europeans are going to continue to spend, that it's a Ukraine problem less than it's a NATO problem. But they don't feel that way. And they don't feel that way because it's not just that Trump poses a threat to security, national security commitments, but also because his view of democracy is antithetical to what a lot of the Europeans stand for. We saw that at the Munich Security Conference. We saw Vance. We saw Elon Musk calling for a win for the AfD, which is considered a neo-Nazi party by most Germans. The Americans had, after World War II, led denazification. Now many Germans think the Americans are leading Nazification. That is obviously something that is core to national security, and many European leaders now feel that there are two guns to their head. A gun from the Russians in terms of national security, and a gun from the Americans in terms of disinformation, undermining rule of law and democracy. And so, you know, what can they do in that environment? It's not about collective security. It's about the Europeans standing up for themselves. And I think that is really what we're going to be seeing over the coming weeks and months, coming from pretty much every corner of the European Union.
Thank you, Toria.
Well, just to say that Trump has a little less leeway on the NATO side than he does on the Ukraine side from U.S. body politic, and particularly from the U.S. Congress. Just to remind that at the end of 2023, as part of the National Defense Authorization Act, the Congress passed a bill overwhelmingly saying that a U.S. president could not withdraw from NATO without a vote of the U.S. Congress. And the votes are not there for obvious reasons. And I think the U.S. military would have huge problems with that because of the force projection platforms that we have across Europe, whether they are bases in the UK or Germany or Italy or now Poland that we use to keep ourselves safe. I think Ian said it very, very well, that it's not simply about US security cooperation with Europe against all kinds of threats, not just Putin, but talking now about Chinese coercion, about potential future missile threats from Iran, etc. This is also about the message that we send, whether it's the US or whether it's Europe and other NATO allies, if Putin is allowed to seize and keep territory by force. It's a permission structure for any large country to go off and bite off a piece of its neighbor and get to keep it. And obviously the Chinese are watching that and other countries are watching that. So it is a might makes right strategy, which is going to come back to bite us, and which, if we recall, was what brought Europe to grief twice in the 20th century, and why we ended up with NATO in the first place was a collective democratic security system against these kinds of threats. So that said, there are still 90,000 US forces in Europe, which is the highest deployment that we've had for a long, long time, and that is a direct result of Putin's aggression. I do think it would be a good thing if Europe could, rather than thinking about peacekeepers in Ukraine for a peace that hasn't been made yet, be thinking more about upping its own quotient on the eastern flank to send a message to Putin and to others.
Thank you, Toria. So back to you, Secretary Clinton. So let's look at kind of more globally, touching on what Toria was just saying. Some in the administration said, well, he just wants to end a war. It's a horrible war. That's how he thinks he can last. But obviously, and you and I teach the class on inside the situation room, and we talk about the issues of reputation and credibility, and how much they are really, there's a lot of interdependence and the perception of not weakness, but here it's really the ceding of so many of the demands to Russia. What are other autocratic regimes and players are inferring? What are the inferences that they draw from this? How worried are you about this kind of Americans' global reputation, how it's going to play out in the eyes of Xi Jinping and other actors in this kind of, looking at the axis of resistance at this moment, looking at the United States and what Trump is his approach to Putin at this moment?
Well, I'm very worried. I think it's impossible to overstate how what Trump is doing heartens our adversaries and demoralizes our friends and allies. There was just in the last 24 hours a quite remarkable speech from a French senator in the parliament in Paris, in which he made, I thought, an argument tinged with regret and even sadness about how Europe could no longer count on the United States, how Europe had to rally itself for its own defense. And he was, I think, expressing the views of many of our friends, literally from Europe to Asia. So the reputational hit for our country is certainly real. I don't know what Trump himself feels or assesses about this. I do think the very quick negative response to what happened in the Oval Office did set them back. I don't think they were expecting that. I think that the kind of firestorm that was ignited even in the right-wing media here in this country and particularly in the UK caused them to take a beat. But he gets dug in on positions, and as we heard in the speech to the Congress about taking over the Panama Canal, taking over Greenland, all of that, he has these fixations, and I think he will continue to, at least behind the scenes, very much favor his relationships with Putin and his commitment to ending the war at any cost to Ukraine. I also, as I think Toria said, have to believe that Xi Jinping is watching this very closely and understands the calculus that goes into whatever moves he eventually does make with respect to Taiwan, which has to be deeply concerning to South Korea, to Japan, to Australia. And the interjection of North Korean troops is something that we should talk about more and take more seriously, because if North Korea is going to start being a contractor for autocrats, what does that mean with respect to China? So if you were to lay all of this out on some kind of chart, I think the damage to American credibility, to our reputation, to our reliance has been profound. I always want to be optimistic and say it can be recovered, but I don't know if it can be recovered in the short term or even the medium term, given the current administration. So we have to do more things like this and try to lay out all of the downsides and the disadvantages, because it does come back to bite America. This is not about something over there. This is about, our security and our future right here.
Thank you. We want to take questions from the audience, but before that, there are a few more things I want to get to. Stephen and Toria, let's talk about thinking about the post-ceasefire scenario. Europeans are discussing peacekeeping force for Ukraine, but they also want a US backstop. Is that the right priority? Do you think can and should the European other forces deploy into Ukraine with or without US backstop? What are the pros and cons? So maybe Toria, let's start with you, and Steve, I want to ask you more specifically about the peacekeepers option.
So I would just say, both in the context of an agreed ceasefire to just hold on current lines but to buy time for a larger discussion, or perhaps that's the only aspiration of both the Trump administration and Russia, or in the context of a complete settlement, including whatever is done with regard to territory. If you have a neutral Ukraine, as Putin has been requesting, and a disarmed Ukraine, then there's nothing to stop Putin for coming back for more. And we saw it in his violation of the Budapest Memorandum when he attacked Ukraine after he agreed not to when they took out their nuclear weapons in the 90s. And we saw it, between the first Little Green Men invasion of 14, 15, 16, and then coming back for more in 22. So not only does there have to be security ongoing for Ukraine, and they need to be allowed to have as much of a military force as they feel they need to deter Putin with our support and with European support. There is a question of what happens if Putin still tests that. Will we be there to support Ukraine? I am not sure that international peacekeepers on the ground, even behind the Ukrainian lines, is the best answer. We've seen that sometimes goes badly, as it did in Bosnia with Srebrenica. But I do think that there are lots of capabilities that the US and Europe could bring to bear from outside Ukraine that could be used to strike a Russia that violated any ceasefire that it had agreed to. And that's going to be necessary. And no Ukrainian leader, Zelensky or anybody else they might elect, can agree to a deal that doesn't include security, given the recent history.
Thank you. So Steve, going to you, what type of military, what do you see the military function of foreign troops that really could maybe comprise this kind of security assurance piece? How do you assess that?
Yeah, it would not be classic interpositional peacekeeping, right? This isn't a scenario in which a handful of blue-helmeted UN folk are going to patrol some demilitarized zone between two. That's not what's in the cards here, because Ukraine wouldn't reasonably accept that, because in the event of a renewed war, they'd just get blown to the side, and you'd end up with the same fate that Ukraine would suffer without them. So the force designs I've heard talked about so far for some kind of security assistance force are usually in the kind of 20 to 50,000 soldier neighborhood. Everybody involved would much prefer that many of those be Americans. The key American at the moment, Donald Trump, seems not to prefer that. So it looks like any plausible contribution will be exclusively non-Ukrainian European. The Europeans can probably produce 20, 50,000 soldiers in a relatively short time period to serve this function. And remember, this is a function in addition to a mobilized Ukraine. This is not 30 or 50,000 troops who are going to try and defeat the Russians by themselves. These are reinforcements to an existing Ukrainian military. The problem the Europeans would have in the short term, at least, is twofold. One is existing European militaries are designed to operate in a coalition that includes us. So their logistical systems, their communication systems, their air defense and deep strike capabilities are all premised on the idea that they're fighting together with the United States and we wouldn't be there. So it's going to take quite a while, if at all, until European militaries can be restructured in a way to provide these kinds of supporting and enabling capabilities that they don't now have and never thought they were going to need. Secondly, multinational forces of this kind can work if they've got a long period of time to operate together and accommodate one another to their different operating systems and doctrines and training and culture and all the rest. This is going to be a pickup force. It's not going to be a NATO operation. It's going to be a coalition of the willing, is the phrase. Now, if it mirrors an existing NATO multinational core, then the elements would have worked together and they might be militarily efficacious. If not, it's going to take some time before they iron out the operational modalities required to be efficient fighting together. So there are lots of reasons to suspect or to be concerned that a security assistance force, if it's not done right, could easily be kind of a Potemkin military that would not have the kind of deterrent effect that everyone hopes and wants and needs it to be. To get a real force that could actually deter Russia is a challenging operation, especially so if it doesn't involve Americans.
Yeah. Tim, do you want to jump in from the perspective of Russia, Putin, like he will view this kind of?
Yeah, I mean, they've already made the point clear that foreign soldiers on the ground would be treated as a direct act of war against Russia. Now, this wouldn't be the first time that the Russians have declared a red line that got crossed without great consequences. So, and it's coming from Lavrov, who might not be the most authoritative person in the Kremlin's decision making. But in general, this is an issue that they want to see a Ukraine that is, as Tori put it, neutral and disarmed and weak and vulnerable, so that, something along the lines of Belarus, as I mentioned before, which is really not a pretty picture. Particularly given, Ukraine is 4 times larger, has much more territory, is much better able to defend itself, given the opportunity. And, the broader picture here, of course, is that the war could end tomorrow, right? If Kremlin troops left, the war would be over. This is not a case where 2 countries were clashing over some territory or some ideal. It was one country invading another and another trying to rebuff it. So, it's a little bit odd that all of the attention has been focused on what can Ukraine do to bring peace to this matter, not what can Russia do.
So we have a few questions from the audience. The first one, any one of you, please feel free to jump in. Is the latest dispute between the United States and Ukraine a precursor to the US walking out of NATO? What are the odds that NATO will part ways with the United States? Ian, Ian, Toria, Hillary, anybody?
Tori had the good point on that, so she should take it.
Toria.
Just to say, I think in some way we already covered this. I think it would be extremely difficult, both in U.S. popular opinion, vis-a-vis the U.S. military, vis-a-vis Republicans in Congress, and with this new legislation for President Trump to do in this second term what he threatened to do in the first term, which is why the legislation was passed, which is just walk out of NATO. Which is not to say that, you know, he couldn't try. We've
Yeah.
seen him try wilder things. But, you know, if he moves in that direction in the short run, it's just going to be another gift to Putin in advance of any kind of talks. And it's going to further destabilize European allies who, as we've said, you know, are already distrustful and thinking about how they move on without us.
So you think it's highly unlikely at the moment? Anyone disagree with that we should? No. All right.
Well,
What is it? Yep.
There's de jure withdrawal and there's de facto withdrawal. There are a variety of barriers to Trump formally withdrawing the United States from NATO, but the whole premise of NATO is the security guarantee provided by the United States. If European members come to doubt whether the United States would backstop them, then the paper treaty might still be technically in force, but it wouldn't accomplish any of the geopolitical purposes that the alliance is to serve. So I think a lot of this turns on perceptions of what the Trump administration's intentions are. And those perceptions have changed quite a bit, I think, in the last few days.
I'm going to add to that, actually. The two things, just because this has been kind of a downbeat conversation. First is that we can all imagine a situation where the Europeans really do stand up. They're talking about, you know, sort of seizing the Russian assets that they're frozen. They're spending a lot more money. They're prepared to actually put boots on the ground. They don't feel like they need the Americans. And Trump takes it as a win, embraces it, says, I'm the only one that was able to get the Europeans to actually take the lead. This should be a European problem. We should be focused much more on Asia Pacific. And this is a win. And I'm going to count it as such. And the Europeans would be thankful, many of them, to engage with the Americans on that. Certainly the Brits, the Italians leading the way, because the alternative is kind of a disaster for them, right? So there still is a possibility for that, number one. Number two is that, you know, if the Europeans really do stand up, and they really do spend the money, and they really do engage in a common European defense capability, I don't necessarily see this as a win for Russia in 5 years' time. You know, I mean, they get a piece of Ukraine, sure, but the rest of the Ukrainians hate these guys forever. And Europeans who were happy to spend nothing on their defense and not worry about the Russians and engage with Nord Stream 2 and all the rest are suddenly actually together and view Russia collectively as an adversary. And Hungary is left out of that because it's a coalition of the willing. So, I mean, I see an environment here where, yes, it's true, the Americans are losing a lot of soft power and a lot of people aren't committed to the U.S. the way they should be, but the Russians are not winners here. I don't see that.
Anyone wants to to comment on what Ian just the kind of the possible other future we could see here?
Look, I think that if Russia gains de facto political, economic, military control of Ukraine, Europe is greatly, the threat to Europe is increased, the threat globally is increased. The threat that will create a hugely volatile situation on the ground in Ukraine, more refugees, partisan fighting and all of that, the kinds of things that we saw that brought us ultimately into both World War I and World War II goes up exponentially. And I just want to foot stomp one point Steve made, which is that, yeah, you don't have to pull out of NATO to greatly weaken our commitment to NATO and further imperil European confidence in us, including confidence in our nuclear umbrella, which is at the core of it. You already see Macron saying, hey, my nukes will protect you all. What will Germany have to decide? What will Poland have to decide? What will that say to Japan and Korea and Saudi with regard to nuclear weapons? So there's all of that. But just to say, with regard to Steve's other point, I do think it's important to think about what a ground force, international ground force for Ukraine would look like. But modern weaponry allows us to protect a peace with standoff forces. And I think if the US were prepared to support that, that might be far more beneficial for a whole bunch of reasons, including not getting Europeans trapped with a Russian army coming at them. Over.
Two quick questions. Quickly, if anyone wants to comment, how will humanitarian aid in Ukraine be affected in the coming months, given the recent budget cuts at the UN as a result of the current administration? Anyone wants to?
Well, look, I think that, it wasn't just the UN. USAID was supporting a lot of humanitarian efforts in Ukraine. And the situation there is very unclear given the Supreme Court decision last night, because it goes back to Steve's point about NATO. It appears as though the court has ordered the administration that, they cannot unilaterally end aid, but whether the administration takes that to heart, whether they turn the aid back on, whether they are able to make up for the real pause in aid where people have been laid off and clinics have been closed. We don't know that yet. But the absence of humanitarian aid is a really serious problem, because it goes to Tori's point. I mean, part of what has to be on our agenda is how we help sustain Ukrainian morale, how we help provide support for Ukrainian basic services, how we recognize the trauma and work to help alleviate that. And that takes humanitarian dollars. And if USAID, if the United States is not in that game, then it's going to be much harder to do.
Thank you. And the last question is really not about Ukraine, but it's like looking at this the presidency of Donald Trump, and that's, its approach to dealing with international conflict of that sort. So people are asking, the students are asking, will the current administration deal with Taiwan issues like it has with the Ukrainian issue? And I know it's a big question, and we really literally have less than a minute, but anyone wants to speculate on that?
Well, Ian, you run something called the Eurasian group, so I think
okay, I'll be very quick. Hillary. I think that on the one hand, China sees that the U.S. doesn't care about something far away like Ukraine. Taiwan's even farther away. On the other hand, there's been so much focus on China's the enemy here. We want to split Russia away from China, do the reverse Nixon. And if I were China, I don't have enough information. So what I would do is militarily test the United States and its allies in small ways to understand how the Americans are going to respond. That live fire exercise they didn't announce off Australia coast by Taiwan as well, we're going to see a lot more of that.
Or I think we're at time too. So let me best conclude by saying, first of all, thank you to the panelists for really such insightful conversation. I know I've learned a lot. And to our viewers, thank you so much for joining us. As I said at the beginning, there are different views about this conflict and about U.S. approach to it. This is the first of several conversations we will be holding at the Institute of Global Politics at SIPA around this. Please stay tuned for more on this. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great and wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.